On the night of October 4th, 1967, sometime around 10 p.m., a woman called into a local radio station in Halifax, Nova Scotia, to report seeing a mysterious orb of bright orange light, 40 to 50 feet across, drifting out over the harbor. Immediately after her call, another listener phoned into the station in a panic and confirmed seeing the same fiery orb. In the skies overhead, Pan American World Airways Flight 160 pilot Ralph Lowinger also noticed something strange while flying over eastern Canada, a formation of 4 bright lights seemingly headed across the plane's flight path. Lowinger grabbed the controls to slow the plane's momentum and allow whatever was emitting the lights to pass in front, but the lights did not veer closer. Instead, they seemed to hang there, suspended in the sky. Aboard the MV Nickerson, a fishing vessel adrift in the waters off the coast of Sambro, Nova Scotia, Captain Leo Howard Mersey stared down at the ship's radar with some confusion. 4 distinct blips were pinging in the waters northeast of their position. Captain Mersey looked up in the direction indicated to see 4 bright orbs of light in a rectangular formation hovering in the sky. He and his crew stood on the deck of the Nickerson and watched the objects with wonder, and Mersey phoned the harbor master to report the strange lights and ask for an explanation. He would file another report with the local Mounties upon arriving in port, but as the night's events continued to unfurl, a plausible explanation began to seem less and less likely. An hour later, some 150 miles to the southwest of Halifax in a sleepy fishing village called Shag Harbour, 18-year-old Laurie Wickens was driving home with some friends on a dark, winding highway. All of a sudden, Wickens noticed a large glowing object flying low across the horizon. It was flashing 4 lights in succession and seemed to be coming down out of the sky. Wickens pulled his car over to watch until finally the flashing object dropped below the tree line and out of sight. Moments later, Wickens recalls, he heard a whistling sound and a loud bang. He got back in the car and drove them up and over a bend in the road so they could look down on the harbor below. Once they crested the hill, they could see something bobbing on the surface, some 200 yards out into the water, illuminated by a mysterious yellow glow. After staring at the object for a few moments in stunned silence, Wickens and friends drove to a nearby payphone and called the local police to report what they believed to be a plane crash. The Mountie who took the call, Victor Werbicki, did not believe Wickens at first, possibly due to the tendency of teenage boys to make prank calls. Disappointed and unsure what else to do, Wickens and his friends watched the eerie light drifting up from beneath the water's surface as it began to grow dimmer and fade away. Shortly after receiving Wickens' report with some skepticism, Corporal Werbicki received several calls in quick succession, all describing unusual-looking lights or the sound of a loud bang heard echoing over the harbor. Werbicki retrieved the number for the payphone that Wickens had called from and dialed it. Wickens, who was still in the area watching the harbor below, picked up from the payphone. Werbicki apologized for doubting him and agreed to meet him and his friends at the Irish Moss plant on the waterfront. He then radioed the only other 2 Mounties in the area, Officers Pond and O'Brien, and told them to meet him on the waterfront. Pond and O'Brien arrived on the scene first. Through binoculars, Officer Pond was able to see the faint yellow light still glowing on the water beyond, though it would soon fade away altogether. Werbicki arrived shortly after and quickly put O'Brien on the task of finding a boat in the area that they could use to locate the wreckage and, presumably, rescue any survivors. O'Brien phoned the Coast Guard to request assistance shortly after midnight, but was told it would be at least a half hour before anyone would arrive. Shag Harbour resident Norman Smith had seen the flashing sirens of the 2 Mounties pass by their house earlier, and he and his father Wilfred had followed them down to the waterfront to see what the commotion was. It was Norman who suggested that while everyone was waiting for the Coast Guard to arrive, they could call his uncle, Lawrence Smith, a fisherman, and use his boat. Within 10 minutes, Smith and fellow fisherman Bradford Shand arrived. They unmoored their boats and took the Mounties and a crew of volunteers out with them into the harbor. They searched in the dark for any sign of wreckage or debris, using powerful searchlights equipped to the front of the boat, but were unable to spot anything save for a long and thick streak of yellow-orange foam floating atop the water, which the Coast Guard would later corroborate seeing as well. The substance was oily to the touch, and no one on either boat could recall encountering anything like it. Norman remembers the distinct smell of sulfur in the air. Ultimately, though, they came up empty that night. Norman returned the next day to find their crew of 4 divers brought in by the Canadian Navy were scouring the harbor, scanning the depths for any crash material. The presence of the Navy divers and the Mounties' continued involvement raised the curiosity of locals in the otherwise quiet town, and more onlookers began to arrive at the waterfront wondering what was going on. Milton Crowell, an engineer for Nova Scotia Light and Power, was driving through the area with his family when he heard reports on the local radio of a search being run by the Coast Guard for a mysterious object that had fallen into the harbor from the sky. Crowell, intrigued, drove down to the water and found a group of Mounties investigating the shoreline. Crowell asked them what they were doing, and they responded, frankly and without hesitation, that they were there looking for the remains of a flying saucer that had crashed there days earlier. The divers worked through the following days and nights, and reinforcements were brought in to bring their number up to 7. By all appearances, the team had mounted an exhaustive search of the crash area and the seafloor surrounding it, and had continually come up empty. Finally, on October 9th, after 5 days, the official search was called off. Between the Smiths and other local volunteers, the Navy and the Coast Guard, not a single piece of evidence was recovered that validated what so many eyewitnesses had seen or heard that night. No craft, no lights, no survivors. However, with the unidentified flying object having been observed crashing and then floating in Shag Harbour by no less than a dozen witnesses, including 3 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers, the Canadian government was forced to launch an official inquiry. Other high-profile UFO sightings over Canada earlier in the year, such as the Falcon Lake incident and the Dumal, Alberta crop circles, left the Department of National Defence concerned, and the matter was referred to the Royal Canadian Air Force's Air Desk, Canada's Blue Book equivalent. There are claims that a research document signed by the Defence Minister was eventually issued without any conclusions, but determined that, quote, UFOs exhibit advanced technology which could contribute to scientific or technical research. The final report on the Shag Harbour incident concluded on a similarly frustrating and vague note, stating, quote, not a trace, not a clue, not a bit of anything. To this day, decades after the events of October 4th, 1967, the crash at Shag Harbour continues to intrigue and perplex both local residents and UFO enthusiasts who flock to the town to pay homage to what to this day is still the only known UFO sighting that included an official government investigation. Residents embrace the mystery, but theories still abound as to what really happened that night. The presence of a covert U.S. military base a mere 30 miles northeast of the UFO site at Shelburne Harbor presents the intriguing possibility that the Canadian and American governments may have cooperated in collecting the crash debris and running a subterfuge investigation to conceal their involvement. The base was set up to monitor for and intercept Soviet submarines and was outfitted with an array of classified technology and sensors. A lack of any physical evidence retrieved by officials after so many credible sources testified to witnessing both the strange lights over the harbor and a crash certainly adds fuel to the fire of a potential cover-up. Some believe that if not an unexplained object, an unidentified top-secret aircraft may have been being tested in the area. But no hard proof has been found that can tie the military base to the crash or the ensuing investigation, and after such a long and dormant period of ambiguity, it seems those still plagued by the incident in Shag Harbour will have to remain in the dark.